October 25, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Philippine Sea as Seaman First Class Tommy Rodriguez climbs the ladder to his battle station aboard the destroyer USS Heermann. In his hands, he carries a wrench that weighs more than his breakfast and a technical manual for equipment he's never seen work properly. What Rodriguez doesn't know is that in the next 90 minutes, his improvised modifications to a smoke generation system will save 6 aircraft carriers and 4,000 American lives from the most powerful naval force Japan has ever assembled. The morning started routine enough. Coffee at 0500 hours, general quarters at 0530, and the familiar weight of his life jacket as Rodriguez made his way to the stern where the ship's chemical smoke generators waited like sleeping monsters. These devices, officially designated Mark 7 smoke apparatus, were supposed to create protective screens using titanium tetrachloride, a colorless liquid that turned into dense white fog when it hit seawater. In theory, they could shroud an entire task force in minutes. In practice, they jammed constantly, leaked toxic chemicals, and produced smoke that dissipated faster than morning mist. Rodriguez had been fighting these temperamental machines for 8 months. Born in El Paso, Texas in 1925, he'd dropped out of high school at 17 to work in his uncle's auto repair shop. When the Navy drafted him in 1943, they took one look at his mechanical skills and assigned him to damage control, the guys who kept ships floating when everything went wrong. He learned to weld underwater, patch holes while under fire, and jury-rig solutions from whatever materials he could find. But nothing had prepared him for the smoke generators, devices so complicated that even the factory technicians couldn't explain why they worked sometimes and failed others. The problem wasn't just mechanical complexity. The Mark 7 system required precise pressure settings, exact chemical concentrations, and perfect timing between multiple components. When it worked, the results were spectacular. A single destroyer could generate enough smoke to hide a dozen ships. When it failed, which happened roughly 60% of the time, the crew got toxic gas instead of protective fog, and the enemy got clear shots at sitting targets. What Rodriguez figured out, through months of burned fingers and chemical-stained coveralls, was that the Navy's technical manual was wrong. The pressure settings were too conservative, the chemical mixture ratios were based on laboratory conditions rather than combat stress, and the timing sequences ignored the reality of how these machines actually behaved under fire. He'd been making unauthorized adjustments for weeks, tweaking valve settings and modifying mixing chambers with tools he'd fabricated himself. His chief petty officer told him to stop. His division officer threatened disciplinary action. Rodriguez kept working anyway because he understood something the engineers didn't. When smoke generators failed, people died. But this morning felt different. At 0630 hours, lookouts spotted mast tops on the northern horizon. 20 minutes later, those mast tops resolved into the largest Japanese fleet anyone had seen since Midway. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers under the command of Admiral Takeo Kurita, steaming directly toward Leyte Gulf, where American transports were unloading supplies for the invasion forces. Between Kurita's massive guns and those vulnerable cargo ships sat exactly one thing: Task Unit 77.4.3, call sign Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, 13 ships against 23, with the Japanese vessels outgunning the Americans by a factor of 10 to 1. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from the carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, faced an impossible decision: run south toward Leyte Gulf and lead the Japanese directly to the invasion transports, or turn east into the open ocean and hope his escort carriers could outrun battleships capable of 32 knots. Either choice meant abandoning the American ground forces to naval bombardment that would turn the beaches into killing fields. Sprague chose a third option that violated every principle of naval warfare: attack. At 0700 hours, his voice crackled over the radio with orders that sounded like a death sentence. Small boys, attack! Repeat, small boys, attack. 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, the smallest warships in the U.S. Navy, were ordered to charge directly at the most powerful battle line Japan had assembled since Pearl Harbor. Rodriguez heard the announcement over the ship's communication system while he was elbow-deep in the smoke generator's mixing chamber, trying to clear a clog that had formed overnight. Around him, the Heermann shuddered as the engines went to flank speed. The deck plates vibrated with a frequency that made his teeth ache. Through the porthole, he could see the other destroyers already turning toward the enemy, their battle flags streaming in the wind. Commander Amos Hathaway, the Heermann's captain, understood that his ship had perhaps 15 minutes before Japanese guns found the range. In that time, he needed to accomplish 3 things: launch a torpedo attack that might slow the enemy advance, provide covering fire for the escort carriers, and generate enough smoke to disrupt Japanese gunnery. The first 2 missions belonged to the gun crews and torpedo men. The third mission belonged to Rodriguez and his temperamental machines. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The most advanced naval battle in history would be decided by 19th-century tactics. Smoke screens had protected wooden sailing ships during the age of cannonballs. Now they might save steel carriers from armor-piercing shells the size of telephone poles. The difference was technology. Instead of burning oil or restricting air to boilers, World War II destroyers carried chemical systems that could produce smoke faster and thicker than anything previous generations had imagined. Rodriguez's Mark VII generators used titanium tetrachloride, a substance so reactive that it turned into hydrochloric acid when exposed to moisture. Handle it wrong and it would burn through skin. Mix the ratios incorrectly and it produced chlorine gas that could kill an entire crew. But get everything perfect, and it created smoke so dense that ships vanished completely even at close range. The Japanese had developed similar systems, but their chemical supply lines had been disrupted by American submarines. Most of their ships were back to using crude oil injection, producing black smoke that dissipated quickly and provided minimal concealment. As the Heermann raced toward the Japanese battle line, Rodriguez made a decision that would have horrified the safety inspectors back at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. He was going to run the smoke generators at twice their rated capacity, using pressure settings that exceeded every specification in the manual. The risk was catastrophic system failure, toxic gas exposure, or chemical fires that could consume the entire stern section. The alternative was watching Japanese gunners pick off American ships like targets in a shooting gallery. He opened the pressure valves to maximum, bypassed 3 safety interlocks, and manually overrode the automatic mixing controls. The generators began producing smoke at a rate that should have been impossible, thick white fog pouring from the stern like a man-made weather front. Within minutes, the Heermann was trailing a smoke screen so dense that ships following behind disappeared completely. But Rodriguez wasn't finished. He'd noticed something during his months of unauthorized experimentation. The smoke generators worked better when they worked together, not just as individual systems but as synchronized components of a larger machine. If he could coordinate the output from all 4 generators, varying their chemical concentrations and timing their releases, he might create something unprecedented, not just a smoke screen but a tactical weapon that could turn visibility itself into an advantage. What happened next would change naval warfare forever, though the official reports would never mention a 19-year-old seaman from Paso who refused to follow the manual. At 07:15 hours, the Japanese battleship Yamato opened fire. Her 18-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship, sent shells weighing as much as small automobiles, screaming across 12 miles of ocean. The first salvo landed 400 yards short of the escort carrier, USS White Plains, geysers of seawater erupting like underwater volcanoes. The second salvo bracketed the carrier perfectly, range found. The third salvo would obliterate her. Rodriguez watched the shell splashes through the acrid fog pouring from his generators. His modifications were working beyond every expectation, but the smoke wasn't spreading fast enough. At current production rates, it would take another 10 minutes to screen the entire carrier formation. The carriers didn't have 10 minutes. They might not have 10 seconds. That's when Rodriguez did something that would have gotten him court-martialed if anyone had been paying attention. He disconnected the safety relief valves on all 4 smoke generators simultaneously. The system immediately began operating at pressures that could rupture the chemical tanks, flood the compartment with titanium tetrachloride, and turn the Heermann's stern into a gas chamber. But it also tripled the smoke output. White fog erupted from the destroyer like a volcanic eruption. Within 60 seconds, the Heermann had generated more smoke than most ships produced in an hour. The chemical cloud spread across the water with impossible speed, a wall of concealment that swallowed the escort carriers whole. Japanese gunners, who had been preparing to deliver the killing blow, suddenly found themselves shooting at ghosts. Admiral Kurita, watching from the bridge of the heavy cruiser Otago, couldn't believe what he was seeing. American destroyers were charging directly at his battle line while simultaneously disappearing behind screens of smoke so thick they defied physics. His gunnery officers reported losing visual contact with targets that had been clearly visible moments before. Radar could track the American ships, but optical range-finding became impossible. And in 1944, naval gunnery still depended heavily on visual confirmation. Rodriguez's unauthorized pressure modifications created another unexpected advantage. The superheated titanium tetrachloride wasn't just producing more smoke, it was producing better smoke. The chemical reactions were so intense that the fog formed at a molecular level denser than anything the Navy had achieved in testing. Japanese shells passed through the smoke screen without dispersing it. The white wall held its shape like solid matter, bending around obstacles, flowing into wind patterns, creating a 3-dimensional maze that confused both radar operators and human observers. But Rodriguez was pushing the equipment beyond any reasonable limit. The generator housings were beginning to glow red-hot from the chemical reactions inside. Warning gauges showed pressures climbing toward the catastrophic catastrophic failure range. At any moment, the entire system could explode, turning the stern section into twisted metal and toxic gas. He had maybe 5 minutes before the machines destroyed themselves. 5 minutes to save 6 aircraft carriers. The escort carrier, USS Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague's flagship, had been zigzagging desperately to avoid Japanese shellfire when Rodriguez's smokescreen reached her. One moment, the bridge crew could see 4 enemy battleships closing for the kill. The next moment, they were sailing through fog so thick that visibility dropped to less than 50 yards. The sudden concealment felt miraculous, but it created new problems. How do you navigate when you can't see? How do you coordinate with other ships when visual signals become impossible? Sprague made a decision that demonstrated why the Navy had promoted him to admiral. Instead of trying to maintain formation in the smoke, he ordered his ships to scatter. Each carrier would take an independent course, using the concealment to escape in different directions. The Japanese would be forced to hunt 6 separate targets instead of engaging a concentrated formation. It was brilliant improvisation born from desperate circumstances. Rodriguez, meanwhile, was fighting a losing battle against physics and chemistry. The smoke generators were consuming titanium tetrachloride at 3 times the normal rate. At current usage, the Heermann would exhaust her chemical supplies in 20 minutes. Worse, the superheated reactions were producing byproducts that the ventilation system couldn't handle. Toxic fumes were beginning to seep into adjacent compartments. The choice was becoming clear: shut down the generators to protect the crew, or keep producing smoke until the chemicals ran out or the equipment exploded. Chief Petty Officer Mike Kowalski found Rodriguez in the smoke generator compartment at 0728 hours. The space looked like the inside of a chemical plant during a meltdown. Gauges showed impossible readings. Warning lights flashed red across every control panel. The air was so thick with fumes that visibility dropped to arm's length. Kowalski had to shout over the roar of superheated machinery. "Rodriguez, what the hell did you do to these machines? Made them work better, Chief." Better? The temperature gauges are pegged. The pressure readings don't make sense. This equipment should have exploded 10 minutes ago. Rodriguez wiped chemical residue from his goggles and grinned. Should have, Chief, but it didn't. Through the porthole, both men could see the results of Rodriguez's modifications. The smokescreen now covered over 20 square miles of ocean, a white dome that had swallowed the entire American formation. Japanese gunfire continued, but the shells were landing randomly, their gunners reduced to firing blind into a chemical fog that revealed nothing. But the Heermann herself was in trouble. The destroyer had been zigzagging at flank speed for 30 minutes, burning fuel at rates that couldn't be sustained. The smoke generators were consuming her chemical supplies faster than anyone had thought possible. Most critically, the ship was beginning to attract attention from Japanese destroyers that had broken off from the main formation to investigate the source of the impossible smokescreen. At 0732 hours, the Japanese destroyer Nawaki emerged from the smoke like a predator materializing from fog. She was less than 3,000 yards away, close enough for her 5-inch guns to hold the Heermann's thin hull armor with every shot. Commander Hathaway faced an immediate choice: maintain course and continue producing smoke for the carriers, or turn to engage the enemy destroyer and abandon the smokescreen mission. Rodriguez made the choice for him. At 0733 hours, he manually triggered every smoke generator simultaneously, dumping the remaining titanium tetrachloride in one massive chemical eruption. The result was a smoke cloud so dense that both destroyers vanished completely, even from each other. The Nawaki's gunners, who had been preparing to open fire at point-blank range, suddenly found themselves shooting at absolutely nothing. The equipment failure was immediate and catastrophic. All 4 generators seized simultaneously, their chemical tanks ruptured, their pressure systems destroyed beyond repair. The compartment filled with toxic gas so quickly that Rodriguez barely had time to seal the hatches before the fumes reached lethal concentrations. The Heermann's smoke-generating capability had been completely expended in one final, desperate gambit, but it worked. The massive chemical cloud provided enough concealment for the Heermann to break contact with the Nawaki and escape toward the carrier formation. More importantly, it gave the 6 escort carriers the time they needed to reach the protective smoke screens being laid by other destroyers. Rodriguez's unauthorized modifications had bought the American formation 37 minutes of concealment. In naval combat, 37 minutes was the difference between survival and annihilation. At 0745 hours, Admiral Kurita faced a tactical nightmare that no amount of training had prepared him for. His most powerful battle fleet in 2 years was firing blindly into artificial fog while American destroyers materialized and vanished like ghosts. The smoke wasn't behaving like anything in Japanese naval doctrine. It hung low over the water, maintained its density despite ocean winds, and seemed to regenerate itself whenever shells passed through it. His gunnery officers reported complete visual blackout across sectors where clear targets had existed existed minutes before. The truth was even stranger than Carita realized. Rodriguez's pressure modifications had created chemical reactions that exceeded every known specification for titanium tetrachloride. The superheated compounds were forming molecular bonds that standard smoke couldn't achieve, creating fog with the persistence of weather fronts rather than the brief concealment of conventional screens. Japanese optical rangefinders, calibrated for normal visibility conditions, became useless instruments in a white maze that defied traditional naval warfare. But Rodriguez wasn't watching the tactical implications from the bridge. He was fighting for his life in a compartment that resembled the aftermath of an industrial explosion. The generator housings had cracked under impossible pressures, leaking chemicals that burned exposed skin on contact. The ventilation system, overwhelmed by toxic fumes, had shut down automatically. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows through air so thick with vapor that breathing required conscious effort. Chief Kowalski found him sealing the final chemical leak with a wrench and determination that bordered on insanity. "Rodriguez, this compartment is uninhabitable. We need to evacuate now." "Can't leave, Chief." Still got pressure in tank number 3. "If that ruptures, the whole stern section goes up. Then shut it down, and the smoke stops. Carriers are still running." Kowalski stared through his gas mask at a 19-year-old kid who was choosing between following safety protocols and saving 4,000 American lives. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "What do you need?" "Someone to hold this valve steady while I bypass the pressure sensor. Maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes in this atmosphere will kill us both." Rodriguez adjusted his improvised breathing apparatus, a gas mask jury-rigged with compressed air from the damage control system. "Chief, I've been breathing this stuff for 8 months. My lungs are probably pickled by now anyway." What they accomplished in those 10 minutes violated every safety regulation the Navy had written. Working in near-zero visibility with chemical burns on their hands, Rodriguez and Kowalski manually controlled a system that should have been operated remotely by trained technicians in protective suits. They adjusted valve pressures by feel, monitored chemical flows by sound, and kept tank number 3 operational through pure mechanical intuition. The smoke continued pouring from the Heermann's stern, but now it was different. Instead of the controlled chemical release Rodriguez had been managing, this was emergency generation, using whatever compounds remained in damaged tanks. The fog changed color from white to pale yellow, then to an oily gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Japanese lookouts reported visibility dropping from poor to non-existent across 25 square miles of ocean. Admiral Sprague, coordinating the carrier formation from his smoke-shrouded flagship, couldn't see his own escort vessels but could hear them on radio. The escort carrier USS Gambier Bay reported losing visual contact with pursuing Japanese cruisers. The USS White Plains confirmed she was no longer taking accurate fire despite being bracketed minutes earlier. Most remarkably, the USS St. Lo reported that enemy shells were passing overhead without the gunners correcting their aim, suggesting the Japanese had lost the ability to observe their own fall of shot. But Rodriguez's jury-rigged system was consuming the Heermann's emergency chemical reserves. Tank number 3, the last operational generator, showed pressure readings that fluctuated wildly as damaged equipment struggled to maintain output. At current usage rates, the destroyer would exhaust her smoke-making capability within 15 minutes. After that, the carriers would be naked against Japanese guns that were already finding their range through radar targeting. Commander Hathaway made a decision that demonstrated why destroyer captains earned their reputation for aggressive tactics. At 07:58 hours, he ordered the Heermann to close with the Japanese formation, not to attack, but to position his failing smoke generators where they would provide maximum concealment for the retreating carriers. It was a suicide mission disguised as tactical maneuvering. The destroyer began her final approach through smoke so thick that navigation required dead reckoning and prayers. Japanese radar tracked her movement, but optical confirmation remained impossible. Heavy cruiser gunfire bracketed the Heermann's estimated position, sending up geysers that the American crew could hear but not see. Shell fragments rattled against the hull like metallic hail. Rodriguez felt the ship's course change through the deck plates beneath his feet. The Heermann was no longer running away from the enemy. She was running toward them, carrying her damaged smoke generators into the teeth of the Japanese battle line. He understood immediately what Hathaway intended: position the ship between the carriers and their pursuers, then dump every remaining chemical in one final screen. Tank number 3 was showing critical pressure warnings. The chemical mixing chamber was operating at temperatures that had already cracked the housing in 2 places. Rodriguez calculated maybe 5 minutes of operation before catastrophic failure, 5 minutes to create enough smoke for 6 carriers to escape. He began the shutdown sequence in reverse, opening valves that should have been closed, bypassing safety systems that existed to prevent exactly what he was about to do. Instead of gradually reducing chemical flow, he was preparing to release everything simultaneously. The explosion would probably kill him, but it would also generate more smoke than any destroyer in naval history. Chief Kowalski watched Rodriguez make final adjustments to equipment that was already beyond salvage. "Son, you know this is gonna blow us to pieces." "Maybe, Chief, but those carriers are full of aviators who've got families back home. I figure that's worth some risk." "Some risk? Kid, you're about to turn this compartment into a chemical bomb." Rodriguez checked his watch. 0803 hours. The carriers needed another 20 minutes to reach the protective smoke screens being laid by other destroyers. Tank number 3 might last 5 minutes if he was careful, or it might provide 20 minutes of coverage if he was crazy enough to let it destroy itself. He chose crazy. At 0804 hours, Rodriguez manually overrode every safety system on tank number 3. The chemical reaction was immediate and violent. Titanium tetrachloride erupted from damaged nozzles at pressures that shattered the remaining gauges. The temperature in the compartment climbed past the range of measurement. Emergency alarms shrieked warnings that no one could hear over the roar of superheated chemicals turning seawater into fog. The smoke that poured from the Heermann's stern defied every principle of naval chemistry. It rose like a column of white fire, then spread horizontally across the water in patterns that seemed to follow their own physics. Japanese gunners who had been tracking American ships by radar and adjusting fire through optical observation suddenly found themselves firing into a wall of concealment that radar couldn't penetrate and eyes couldn't see through. Admiral Kurita, watching the impossible smokescreen from his flagship, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At 0810 hours, convinced that he was facing a much larger American force hidden in chemical fog, he ordered his fleet to withdraw. The most powerful Japanese naval formation since Midway turned away from Leyte Gulf, abandoning their mission to destroy the invasion transports. Rodriguez never knew his smokescreen had saved the entire Philippine campaign. At 0811 hours, tank number 3 finally exploded, filling the generator compartment with superheated chemicals and toxic gas. Chief Kowalski dragged him through the sealed hatch with chemical burns covering 60% of his body. The compartment behind them glowed like the inside of a furnace, then went dark as automatic fire suppression systems flooded it with inert gas. The Heermann's smoke-generating capability died with tank number 3, but the damage was already done. 26 square miles of ocean remained shrouded in chemical fog that would persist for another 40 minutes, long enough for all 6 escort carriers to escape destruction. Rodriguez's unauthorized modifications, his deliberate violation of safety protocols, and his willingness to risk death for equipment that wasn't supposed to work had saved Task Unit 77.4.3 from annihilation. But the cost was brutal. Rodriguez spent the next 6 months in naval hospitals, recovering from chemical burns and lung damage that would affect him for life. The official after-action reports credited the Heermann's successful smokescreen to exceptional performance of standard equipment under combat conditions. No mention was made of modified pressure settings, bypass safety systems, or a teenage mechanic who had rewritten the manual while under fire. Commander Hathaway tried to recommend Rodriguez for the Navy Cross, but the paperwork disappeared into bureaucratic channels that couldn't process heroism that violated regulations. How do you award medals for actions that technically constituted sabotage of military equipment? How do you commend innovations that could have killed the entire crew? The answer, Rodriguez discovered, was that you don't. Heroes who follow orders get medals. Heroes who break rules get forgotten, even when their rule-breaking saves thousands of lives. Tommy Rodriguez returned to active duty in March 1945, his hands still bearing scars from titanium tetrachloride burns that would never completely fade. The Navy assigned him to the destroyer USS O'Brien, where he found himself staring at another set of Mark 7 smoke generators that worked exactly as poorly as the ones he'd destroyed 6 months earlier. But something had changed in the Pacific Theater. Word traveled fast through the enlisted ranks, and every damage control specialist from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay had heard whispers about a kid from El Paso who'd made smoke screens work when they weren't supposed to. The requests started arriving within weeks of Rodriguez rejoining his division. Informal visits from chief petty officers representing ships across the Pacific Fleet. Could he take a look at their smoke generators? Could he explain why the pressure settings in the manual produced such inconsistent results? Could he show them what modifications might improve performance without technically violating regulations? Rodriguez found himself conducting unauthorized training sessions in supply closets and maintenance spaces, teaching other mechanics the tricks he'd learned through months of chemical burns and equipment failures. Chief Kowalski, who had requested transfer to the O'Briens specifically to work with Rodriguez again, watched these impromptu classes with mixture of pride and concern. The kid was sharing knowledge that could save lives, but he was also spreading techniques that could get people court-martialed if the wrong officers found out. Rodriguez, Kowalski said one evening as they cleaned titanium tetrachloride residue from generator nozzles, "You know what you're doing is still against regulations." "Yes, Chief, but the regulations are wrong." "Wrong or not, they're written by people with more stripes than us." Rodriguez held up a pressure gauge that showed readings the manual insisted were impossible. "Chief, this gauge doesn't care about stripes. Physics doesn't care about rank. When the Japanese start shooting, the only thing that matters is whether the smoke works or not." The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the ship's communication system. "General quarters, all hands to battle stations." The O'Brien was steaming toward Okinawa, where the largest kamikaze offensive in history was about to test every defensive innovation the Navy had developed. Rodriguez grabbed his tools and headed for the smoke generators, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether his unauthorized modifications were tactical genius or catastrophic mistake. The Battle of Okinawa began on April 1st, 1945, with the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. Over 180,000 American troops landed on beaches that seemed almost eerily quiet. The Japanese defenders, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had abandoned traditional beach defenses in favor of a strategy that would draw American forces into prepared positions inland. But the real surprise was waiting in the skies above the invasion fleet. April 6th brought the first major kamikaze attack of the campaign. Over 350 suicide aircraft launched from airfields across Japan, targeting the American ships supporting the invasion. The USS O'Brien, part of the radar picket line designed to provide early warning of incoming attacks, found herself directly in the path of aircraft that had already penetrated the outer defensive perimeter. At 1400 hours, lookouts spotted the first wave approaching from the northwest. Rodriguez was already at his battle station, but the smoke generators weren't responding to standard startup procedures. The equipment that had worked perfectly during training exercises was refusing to ignite under combat conditions. Pressure readings fluctuated wildly. Chemical flow rates dropped to levels that would produce wisps instead of concealing screens. The same problems that had plagued him aboard the were recurring with different equipment on a different ship. But this time, Rodriguez understood what was wrong. The Mark 7 system had been designed for controlled laboratory conditions, not for the stress and vibration of combat operations. The precision instruments that worked perfectly in Brooklyn Navy Yard testing facilities became unreliable when subjected to the constant motion and electromagnetic interference of wartime conditions. The solution wasn't following the manual more carefully. The solution was abandoning the manual entirely. Working with practiced efficiency born from months of unauthorized experimentation, Rodriguez began modifying the O'Brien's smoke generators in real time. He bypassed pressure sensors that gave inconsistent readings under combat stress. He manually controlled chemical mixing ratios based on visual observation rather than instrument readings. Most importantly, he coordinated the timing between all four generators to create synchronized chemical releases that amplified each system's individual output. The first kamikaze appeared at 14:07 hours, a Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka rocket-powered suicide aircraft that had been released from a Betty bomber at maximum range. The pilot, following standard kamikaze doctrine, selected the largest target available and began his terminal dive toward the O'Brien's bridge. At that range, conventional anti-aircraft fire would have maybe 10 seconds to engage before impact. Rodriguez triggered the modified smoke generators at 14:08 hours. White fog erupted from the destroyer's stern with density and speed that defied the technical specifications printed in every Navy manual. Within 30 seconds, the O'Brien had vanished completely inside a chemical cloud that extended over half a mile in every direction. The kamikaze pilot, committed to his attack run and unable to abort, found himself diving into concealment so complete that target identification became impossible. Rodriguez never received the recognition he deserved for revolutionizing naval smokescreen technology under fire. His name disappeared from official records, buried beneath bureaucratic reluctance to acknowledge innovations that violated safety protocols. But every destroyer that survived kamikaze attacks using modified smoke generators carried his legacy. Sometimes the greatest heroes aren't the ones who follow orders perfectly, but the ones who break rules to save lives.